Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. In 2020, after the killing of George Floyd, some of the largest protests in U.S. history ensued. And yet, in retrospect, this left action group failed to usher in substantial change. Why did this remarkable grassroots movement fail? Why, in our powerful digital age, do social movements flare up but then lose steam? Why are established institutions and political parties proving to be disappointing and dysfunctional? Jesus, how did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez go from a progressive breath of fresh air to a mainstream Democratic zombie? Could it be the elites? Let's discuss. Well, here we are. Our guest today is Freddie DeBoer, who's written for many mainstream publications, and you're officially a friend of the show, Freddie, because you did The Cult of Smart not quite 2 years ago with your first book. And since then, you've got quite a remarkable Substack career, which we could talk about. But I am excited to discuss your new book, How the Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. How's the book going? How are your...
Thanks for having me again. The promo is going very well. It's been written up into 3 times in the New York Times. 2 out of 3 were positive, so that's nice. As far as sales, it's still too early to say. We'll have to wait and see. But I'm happy with the rollout.
Well, I was listening to the podcast. Sam Harris had Yazak Monk on with his book called The Identity Trap, kind of similar to what you're talking about. And in the first part of the podcast, they mentioned you.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, it was they were trying to figure out what to call all of this, what's going on with the identity. He called it the identity thesis, but he said, Freddie DeBoer says, just tell me what to call the damn ideology. I'll happy to call it that. And so give us some background on your book. Take us back to 2020 and what prompted the book, and do an overview for us.
Yeah, so I conceived of the book in the first few months of 2022, and I officially sold it to Simon & Schuster in May of 2022, which means that I believe the proposal was in their hands in maybe March. I was just looking around and constantly sort of saying to myself, weren't we just in a revolutionary moment very recently? Weren't we talking about a total change to society's relationship to race very recently? Weren't people talking about how the world would never be the same very recently? It seemed to me that we had a moment of explosion in radical politics and racial politics, which was all based off of very good intentions and arose for understandable consequences. And then nothing really happened. And it seemed as though everyone was sort of collectively deciding, well, isn't that embarrassing? Let's just pretend like it never happened. And so this book was just my insistence on sort of saying, like, well, hold on, let's slow down. Let's document this. Let's talk about what happened and what didn't. Let's talk about why, and let's try to figure out if we can do something better in the future. The internet has the memory of a goldfish, and very often people want to move on, right, when their side appears to fail at something for obvious psychological reasons. But the only way you're ever going to do better is if you learn from the past. And that was what sort of was the impetus for the book.
We've had 2 guests with kind of similar themes. We had Chris Parenti on Michael Parenti's son, and he mentioned that also, that the 2020, all the excitement after the Floyd fiasco and how people were so enthusiastic about having change. We also had Norm Finkelstein on, which is, I'll burn this book when I get to it, which is the same general themes that you're talking about how he I think, like you, just got sick of Bernie getting rolled by the Democratic Party being called a racist and a sexist, and you mentioned that a little bit in your book, and it just infuriated him, and he did this autopsy of what's going on. We had one of the largest protests in U.S. history after the Floyd, and it was by and large peaceful, and it incorporated all different groups of people. I was out on the streets. And you've seen this, you've been an activist all of your life. Would you start with the Occupy movement, or was it before that tenant help? Or
yeah, no, I mean the original, the first things that I kind of got involved with were some sort of vague pro-gay, we would have called it gay rights movement back in the late 90s when I was a teenager. So sort of organizing in favor of I mean, even gay marriage was not necessarily what we were calling for, because that had not yet become sort of an issue of national contention. It was just for gay rights and gay respect and gay visibility. And then I got very, very deeply involved in the anti-Iraq war protest movement. I had been sort of radicalized by the 9/11 movement even more than my sort of theoretical politics had been before that. And they ended up spending a ton of time in the anti-Iraq war movement. I went to grad school, and I didn't do a lot of organizing, although I was involved in some sort of grad student labor organizing. And I was the representative of from my department in the grad student government at Purdue, which was the body that negotiated with the school for our healthcare and stuff like that. And then I got to New York City, and I did a half decade or so in New York as a tenants' rights activist. Yeah, I do want to know, because you mentioned the protest, like the size and scope of this protest movement can't be underestimated. It was not just that it was unprecedented number of and size of protests in the United States. There were protests in London, there were protests in Lisbon, there were protests in Sydney, Australia. There were protests in Moscow, if you can believe it. So like that sort of spillover into the international sort of consciousness is rare. And again, it's just, this was an unprecedented moment, and we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, 15 to 26 million people in our country, and then it sparked this through this powerful digital age. It just was like a brush fire, went all over the world, and then it just flared up and went out. What's the reason? Why didn't we get police reform? Why didn't we get change? Who hijacked this?
Well, I think there's as you can guess by the fact that I wrote a book about it, there's multiple answers to that question. But I think the first thing to say is the failure to coalesce around a coherent policy goal was not just a failure of the 2020 moment or Black Lives Matter in general, which goes back to 2014 and the death of Michael Brown. You can make a very strong argument that the failure of the civil rights movement to continue to progress after the Civil Rights Act, after 1965 or thereabouts, the mid-1960s, comes back to that very same thing. The civil rights movement actually took a long time to get going, to gather force and gather steam. But when it did, it very quickly, after it sort of gained public consciousness, sort of set the terms for what they were looking for. The most important of which were the Voting Rights Act, which made impeding someone's right to vote a federal crime, which ensured that if the local sheriff was preventing you from voting as a Black person, then you could get federal marshals to come and enforce your right to a vote. So that was obviously very important. The Civil Rights Act is sort of an omnibus piece of legislation that bans all kinds of discrimination based on race. For example, the lunch counters could no longer say whites only, etc. There are victories that follow that. Victories against housing discrimination were a really big deal that were largely secured in the late 1960s. But by and large, after about the mid-1960s, the civil rights movement runs out of steam. Martin Luther King said so himself. The civil rights movement's inability to continue sort of making victories happen leads to the empowerment of the Black Power movement, epitomized by the Black Panthers, but also the Nation of Islam, as run by Elijah Muhammad and later Louis Farrakhan. And through to today, there's just a lack of what exactly do we want to be the policy ask on the issue of racial equality and racial justice. So I think the first thing is no one really came down to any actual sort of demand. To the degree that there was a demand, it was defund the police. As I detail in the book, that demand was problematic, number one, because no one could agree about what it meant, but number two, because we were never going to get it even if they could agree. And so there was no sort of sense of like, even, okay, we know what we want, even if we can't get it right now. There was a bill called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill, which was a federal bill of criminal justice reform that had many provisions in it, many of which were good provisions that were worth fighting for. But that bill was caught in the middle because it was seen by activists as being a watered down compromise, and it was seen by conservatives as being anti-police. And so when it died a death in Congress, nobody really mourned for it. But it was the sort of thing that could have actually happened and could have gotten done. And then the other major element of why nothing happened is, as you alluded to, the whole thing became institutionalized. The institutions that were supposedly speaking out in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement and the organic street protests effectively co-opted them, took over the movement, grabbed the reins, grabbed the national attention, and institutions have a tendency by nature to favor symbol over real change.
Greg, you've been an activist longer than any of us. Didn't you work on the Eugene Debs, work with him, or you've been?
Yeah. He was. I mentored him. I mentored Eugene Debs. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, you've been through a lot of these movements.
I enjoy listening to Freddie talk about these different things because he's absolutely right. I mean, you have to stop and think about how these things got knocked off the tracks, whether it's the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Occupy movement, on and on. He's spoke to it very well. And it is a question of hijacking on one side, and I think mistakes on the other side. And he's right about it being complex. I mean, both those things play a role in it. I think you look at take DSA. Let's talk about something neutral, a political movement that comes from nowhere and suddenly has 90,000 members. And now today it's in profound crisis. You have to ask yourself why. Why do these things go the way they go? And obviously, a lot of it's the way they organize themselves, the way they put forward. I think Fred mentioned earlier the how they develop issues and so forth. But it's also the channeling into the Democratic Party. I don't think you mentioned that yet, but I'm sure you'll talk about it. But much of this gets channeled into the Democratic Party, into electoral politics, and it sucks the life out of it. If you go back to the civil rights movement, once you enact the legislation, that kind of sucks a lot of the life out of it. People think it's settled. And anti-war movement, once there's movement in the Democratic Party to stop the war as well, it sucks the life out of it, so on and so forth. So you have that outside co-opting. I think that's your title alludes to that when you talk about the elites. But it is complex, and I really appreciate the fact that you're exploring this. So yeah, I mean, let's talk more about that.
Well, I mean, let's look at like gay rights, for example. If you run in sort of lefty circles, like I do, there's a narrative that you hear fairly often, which is that essentially cisgender gay men fought for gay marriage, they got it, and then they immediately depoliticized, right? Now, they essentially wanted something, were part of a radical movement, went to the Pride Parade and demanded change and showed up in Washington. And then when they got what they wanted, they sort of dispersed to life in, townhouses and in sort of Tony sort of like comfort. And now that gay people have respectability. Obviously, that's a massive generalization, And I'm not sure if I agree with that characterization in general. But at the same time, it's interesting because people deride that as sort of this horrible, lamentable condition where these cisgender gay men have all this privilege, and then once they got what they wanted, they abandoned the rest of the movement. Because in a certain sense, that's what we're fighting for, right? Like the right to become normal people, right? The right to just be sort of become part of the tapestry of American life in a way that's sort of not threatened. And now gay marriage is codified in this country not merely through Supreme Court precedent, but now through actual federal legislation passed by Congress. You know, that's kind of the point. Obviously, I don't want people to be depoliticized. And obviously, I want people to keep fighting for others even after they have victory on their own side. But if it is in fact true that many gay men sort of depoliticized after the fight for gay marriage, that only means that like we've been successful, right? And I mean, in a very real way, if you look at, for example, the fight for trans rights, that's a fight for trans identity to become depoliticized in just the same way that gay identity has been depoliticized, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's this old saying in the gay rights movement that like my existence is a crime, right? That like being gay in and of itself was like a radical act. And now many people argue that it is no longer a radical act. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it's true, like that just means that we won, right? We won that issue. And so there's a fundamental sort of cyclical thing we have to understand as people who are fighting for the normalization and the better integration of minority groups into American life, that the more that we succeed, right, the more that we're creating conditions that can de-radicalize people, if that makes sense.
Hey, I was thinking of you, Freddie, when I read Chris Hedges' blog or Substack 2 days ago. The title was Fascism Comes to America. The failure of the liberal class to halt the corporate assault on working people has spawned an ascendant Christian fascism that's poised to seize power and radically reshape America. So he's blaming the liberal class to kind of abandon the working class people, and again substituting in the politics of identity, and it's just creating this ascendance of possibly the next Trump term. And you mentioned this pretty cleverly in your book when you were talking about a couple of old heroes of mine, Fred Hampton and Bobby Seals, who were Black Party members. Tell me how that might relate to what Chris Hedges is saying here about the class issue.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say is that I respect Chris Hedges, but like I personally just don't go for sort of telling people fascism is at the door, because fascism has been at the door for the entirety of my political life. I mean, I think that there's this assumption now that like history began with Trump, right? Like that prior to Trump, the Republicans did not have a crazy base or something. The Gingrich Revolution in the mid-1990s, if you can go and you can check out, had a lot of people saying fascism was at the door, right? Like this is a cyclical element of American politics. I think Donald Trump is a monster. He's also the third worst president of my lifetime, right? Like, and that's, it's important to sort of not give into the constant temptation to say, oh, okay, this time's special because fascism is at the door. That said, Hedges is correct to say that, I mean, look, I look at the numbers in the book. It's been very persuasively argued that the sort of Democratic plan of maintaining a base of voters of color, dominating among college-educated whites, will win out even as the Democratic Party continues to hemorrhage white working class voters without college degrees. Chuck Schumer famously said that it didn't matter if they lost Rust Belt, sort of white working class whites, because they would gain 2 votes for every one that they lost. They would gain 2 votes from upwardly mobile professionals in the suburbs. He said that in 2016, and that obviously did not work out, right? Roy Teixeira is a political scientist, and he was instrumental in writing. He was one of the co-authors in the book, The Enduring Democratic Majority, which was, I think, from around the turn of the century, around the turn of the millennium, which argued that the Democrats were going to have like effectively a permanent majority because the racial dynamics of the country were changing, and that meant that they would always have a numerical advantage. He has since walked that back completely, and he argues that, in fact, the situation is far darker than that for Democrats because, number one, white working class voters, which are not poor voters for the record, because poor people don't vote, but like sort of like, lower middle to middle class white voters who don't have college degrees in general, we're talking about. They are disproportionately represented in the Senate and in the Electoral College. That, in other words, when it comes to winning presidential elections, or especially when it comes to having Senate power, one worker who's a white working class voter in Pennsylvania is just fundamentally worth a lot more than a upwardly mobile college educated voter in California or a black voter in New York, just because of the structure of American institutions. And we can lament that structure, but it exists. The other important thing to say is voters of color are not following the script. So there has been a massive movement of Hispanic voters away from the Democratic Party since the John Kerry election. And as I've tried to point out many times, with Hispanic voters in particular, it's not clear why anyone ever assumed that they would always be Democrats. Right? The notion that Hispanic voters were always just natural Democrats never made a ton of sense to me, right? And I've said this before, but if I tell you to picture a voter who's someone who lives in rural Texas, who owns their own cattle ranch, who's an NRA member, and a devout Catholic, you would say, well, that person is a Republican. But that describes a perfectly common type of Hispanic Republican in Texas, right? In other words, many Hispanic Americans are coming from religious milieus, social milieus, etc., that we associate with conservatism. And what we're finding now is that race is not some all-powerful eraser that wipes away all those other attributes and makes people into good liberal Democrats. The movement from black voters from Democratic to Republican is numerically tiny and probably not very meaningful electorally, but it does demonstrate. And this is almost entirely a movement of black men. It does demonstrate again that just like you assume that a race is going to support your party at your own peril, right? And so what Hedges is talking about is like, look, the sort of baked in democratic assumption that over time changing demographics means that they don't have to worry about the mythical sort of white working class voter just doesn't work in terms of math. And it shouldn't have to be a crisis, because that's a kind of voter that not that long ago Democrats did very well with. Bill Clinton cleaned up with those voters, right? I mean, you could argue those voters were the Clinton base. There's no reason why we can't appeal to them again, but you actually have to appeal to them. And appealing to them means that you have to defy the interests of, the groups, right? Like the nonprofits and the lobbying groups that do so much to set the Democratic message.
So, Greg, go back to your thesis that, in talking with you and doing podcasts with you, I think you think the Democratic Party is a large part of the problem because of their abandonment of the working class. And I mean, how did AOC go from somebody that was just a rock star that I had all these hope in, and you look at AOC now and she's just like got a brain tumor or something. I don't know.
When you brought up Hedges, I agree with Freddie that I think we're being unfair to liberals when Hedges says liberals have let the working class down. Liberals never were for the working class. I mean, they never were part of any real coalition around the working class. They tolerated it, but you know, the Teixeira thing is interesting because it justified the neglect, and just the way that Freddie mentioned, it justified the neglect of white workers, but also of blacks and Hispanic, because they own them. Basically, what he was saying is there's going to be a majority by 2015 of quote unquote minorities in America, and they have to vote for the Democrats. So that just justified it. But it really goes back, I think, to the loss of the South. I mean, the Southern Democrats owned the Democratic Party until the civil rights legislation occurred, and then they went Republican. And so to keep the coalition alive, the Democrats really accepted the suburban white middle class, upper middle class, as a substitute, as a replacement. And they really own the Democratic Party now, in my view. I mean, I don't think it's a sellout of workers. They're just playing to who owns the party, and the party is owned by white upper middle class suburban people who also vote, and they vote all the time, and so they carry a lot of power, and they make campaign contributions much more so than the lower middle class or working class people. So I don't see. To me, it's intractable. I don't see how you can get out of the fact the Democratic Party is bankrupt, because the people that control it now are fundamentally upper middle class, white, suburban people. That's the constituency they play to.
Thoughts on that, Freddie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fundamentally correct. I mean, you know, there's this very odd scenario where college-educated whites have become something like the base of the Democratic Party. I mean, look, like you have very loyal African-American voters. It's worth mentioning, as I say in the book, that African-American Democrats are by and large moderates and not left-leaning, that since the formation of the modern Democratic coalition, the LBJ coalition, they've always been a more conservative force in the Democratic coalition than a liberal or leftist force. But then you also have the sort of white college-educated voters. The white college-educated voters are numerically important for the party in terms of votes, but they are also very importantly, they are the fundraising base of the Democratic Party, because they're the ones with the money, right? So the Democratic Party cannot operate under its current conditions without a lot of donations from doctors and lawyers and engineers and muckety-mucks at nonprofits and and people at tech firms. That the party absolutely needs their money. If you look at the Democrats' approach to taxes, they say the right things about raising taxes on the wealthy. They define the wealthy as people who make more than $400,000 a year. Now, there is a whole sort of group of people who make between $100,000 and $400,000 a year that you could tax more, who are in historical terms not taxed very highly at all, and who are numerically much larger than the people making $400,000 and up. And you'd think, well, that'd be a constituency that the Democratic Party would want to tax. But they never even propose anything like that. Even AOC doesn't talk about that. Why? Because that's the fundraising base of the Democratic Party, and they don't want to piss them off, right? Also, they're the people who are sort of the culture war foot soldiers of the Democratic Party, right? Like, they're the ones writing the New York Times op-eds. They're the ones who go on Twitter and yell and scream, right? They're the ones sharing political memes on Instagram. They're the ones who have cultural capital and cultural influence. And so on the one hand, this all sounds kind of great for the Democratic Party, that you have this these loyal foot soldiers who have money and they're cultured and educated and they have political influence. But the problem is the party is increasingly beholden to them and increasingly afraid of doing anything that bothers them, like raising taxes on people who make $100,000 or more, but also like defying their assumptions on sort of culture and race. I mean, you can look at the 2016 Hillary Clinton campaign as a referendum on, what the Democratic Party thought the college-educated whites wanted to hear, right? Like, why were there so many celebrity sort of glamour sort of events going on when she never campaigned in Michigan or Wisconsin, right? Why were there bizarre tweets with academic vocabulary that almost nobody can understand? Well, the reason for all of that, right? Why have your campaign team be in Brooklyn, which you're going to win New York? You could put it many other places and sort of demonstrate to everyone that you're interested in winning other places than New York and California. It was all one big signaling fest to the people who now make up the funding base, the intellectual base of the Democratic Party. And I mean, look, it's a powerful constituency, right? I think that there are real hindrances for the Republicans that they don't have any educated voters anymore. But it's just a terribly difficult conundrum of how do you expand your reach to people who are outside of the sort of cultural and social assumptions of the sort of liberal college-educated Democrats.
One of the things, Pat, that's impressed me most about Freddie's recent work is the fact that he recognizes a class division in this discussion, which some of our guests in the past have not recognized that division. When you talk about identity politics, for example, identity politics fits in nicely with a black middle class, upper middle class. I live in a neighborhood that's one of the few integrated neighborhoods in the city of Pittsburgh. To my left is an all-white, upper middle class white enclave, which has more Black Lives Matter signs than any place in Pittsburgh. And they go for all the signaling and so on. And to my right is a very poor black neighborhood, almost 100% black neighborhood. There's no recognition in much of the talk about race today. I think Freddie has recognized that quite well. And what that means is that these white liberals to my left get away with all the signaling, as you call it, signaling, all the etiquette of anti-racism. They don't say the wrong words. They welcome people into their coffee clutches, but it's all white, and they do nothing, and they want to do nothing for impoverished black people. We still have ghettos in America. The language is never used, but to my right is a ghetto, literally a ghetto, and so that's lost in all this discussion, and so it helps us understand what identity politics on the racial dimension really comes to, and it comes to signaling rather than doing anything about the plight of majority of black people in America.
Agreed. Freddie, my favorite chapter in your book by far was the nonprofit industrial complex. And we've had on very prominent attorney and fellow used to work at the United Nations, Alfred Dezod, who also talked about the nonprofits and the NGOs unintentionally screwing up things in the United Nations. I'm an educator. I was a director of research. I have firsthand seen how Bill Gates screwed public education more than just about anybody. Unintended consequence. And I think that's the part of what I liked about your chapter on the nonprofits is you don't have to intentionally have to be evil to cause harm with your interactions. Tell us about the nonprofits and how they figure into this.
Sure. I mentioned the groups before, right? Which is a term that's used by journalists who work in DC. It's used by staffers for congressional offices. And the groups are the sort of pressure points of modern American politics. You have ones that are very sort of old, like the Federalist Society, or you have the Ford Foundation. But you also have newer groups like Sunrise, which is a mostly climate change oriented sort of lefty organization that's become very prominent in Democrat spaces. These organizations have outsized influence within our process. They are often groups that have both 501c3 and 501c4 designations. So for people who don't know, when you talk about donating a tax-free donation to a nonprofit group, the nonprofit part, that is usually a 501c3, which is a group that can receive charitable donations with a tax break, but which has certain supposedly strict regulations on engaging in political campaigns and giving to candidates, for example. However, many of these groups have both a 501c3 phase and a 501c4 phase. And the 501c4 can do direct sort of political groups, sort of organizing. The sort of firewall, in practical terms, that's meant to exist between those two sides of the sort of what are essentially the same organizations often doesn't really exist. And there's sort of, there's regulation, but there's in many cases sort of minimal enforcement. These groups are, again, subject to the capture of donors, and they are subject to the capture of staffers. So any sort of left-leaning organization that is designed to push the Democrats in a particular direction and to sort of achieve victory on particular policy goals is going to overwhelmingly be staffed with college-educated Democrats. They are going to be vastly disproportionately represented from schools that are elite schools that are very hard to get into. So I have to constantly sort of tell people who don't know, but the average high school senior never even applies to a school that rejects more students than it accepts. So going to like an exclusive college or an elite college is very rare, but these people are almost all from those environs. They take with them a certain amount of vocabulary and philosophy and understanding of the world. When they look out at the world, what they see is their own experience reflected back at them. And unfortunately, elite college campuses are not representative of the world writ large. So those are the people who staff these organizations. And then the donors to these organizations, again, are the left-leaning people who have money, who are dominantly urban-dwelling, college-educated professionals who live a life that is not just people in the sort of rural conservative hinterlands, but also lives that are not like those of the average Black or Hispanic person. Now, that is sort of setting up these institutions to have sort of like overly radical orientations. And yet they tend to be fundamentally conservative in how they actually act and work and in their effect in the world, because you can't underestimate the dedication to perpetuating themselves among these organizations. In other words, any nonprofit, no matter what its stated goals are, its actual first priority above anything else is to continue existing, right? It's to continue to exist, to continue to pay its staffers, it's to continue to sort of perpetuate itself and its mission. So this didn't make its way into the book, but in researching, I found a couple of nonprofits that had been founded with the explicit goal of eradicating smallpox that are still around, right? I believe the last case of smallpox in the wild was in the 1970s, right? You might think, if you're a naive person, that these nonprofits would say, okay, well, look, we eradicated smallpox. It's the most successful eradication of a disease in the history of humanity. We'll close up shop and call it a day. That is not what they did. They rebranded to be generalist health organizations. Why? Because the people who work there still want jobs, right?
Right.
They don't want their livelihood to cease to exist. There's always this sort of self-perpetuating function that is baked into these organizations. And so it tends to sort of compel them to be careful about the sort of goals that they call for. And again, if we really wanted to fund a significantly larger social safety net, if we wanted to have like a Scandinavian style social state, we'd have to raise taxes on not just the 1%, but the top 20%. And again, Democrats don't want to do that. And the sort of the donors who fund these organizations don't want to do that, because that's who they are, is the top 20%. And so these organizations tend to focus very heavily on cultural issues, social issues, and to back off of pocketbook issues of basic sort of economic justice and economic fairness. So they tend to be fixated extremely tightly onto issues of symbolism and culture war, because those allow them to rattle the drum and to get donors to keep donating without threatening their donation base, which is always their first priority. And in the book, I quote a woman who ran the Wikimedia Foundation for a long time. She was the person who kept the lights on at Wikipedia, and she says, fundamentally, any organization of this nature, its fundamental issue will always be fundraising. And over time, the nonprofits become factories for having black tie dinners in order to fund themselves, rather than to do whatever it is they're meant to do.
Right. I'd like to, before we finish, I want to talk about your writing, both your writing and Greg's writing. It just flabbergasts me how prolific you both are. Greg is a writer for Marxist-Leninists Today and has his own blog. I'm trying to get him to start a Substack, but he's set in his ways. 2 years ago, you were living in a small little place in Park Slope and struggling just struggling with your writing, and you are a poster boy for successful Substack. And what I like about both of your writing is you are so eclectic. I mean, you write about sports, you write about politics, you write about your most recent one was a story of the mental health issue and lack of mental health. You write about education. Greg does the same thing. The topics are prolific. I mean, are quite eclectic. Should Greg start a Substack? Are you happy with it? Are you happy with how you're communicating with people in that format?
So I would start with like the CMS, the actual sort of website and the functionality. I have to give it up to Substack. It has everything that I want in terms of being a writer. It is significantly better than when I started in early 2021. And they have made a lot of improvements, that it's a much more stable and better product now. I am fundamentally like platform agnostic. I try not to get too invested in platforms, and I'm very grateful to Substack for what they've done to me. I've let them know that, I know that I could decamp for someplace else and bring my readers with me. I'm not sort of worried about that. But I think Substack is as good as a place as any, and they do make the ability to get paid seamless, which is not true. Like if I was still on WordPress, I could do it, but then I'd have to sort of have MailChimp handle the email, and then I'd have to set up my own thing through Stripe or something like that. I'm fundamentally kind of incompetent at pragmatic stuff, at sort of administrative stuff, so that helps a lot. But it's like anything else, I think that I've been successful in this industry because I do believe that my work is very good, but also like there's just been so much weird chance and like network effects going into it. I mean, I started blogging in 2008, which was an interesting time to start blogging because blogging had already become kind of uncool by then. Like the big players like Matt Iglesias and Ezra Klein and Andrew Sullivan, like they had all already gone back to traditional media, right? Like they had already sort of left sort of independent blogging behind when I started an independent blog. But that being said, I started early enough that like you could still sort of insert yourself into the conversation. And I was just kind of a pain in the ass in the comments of other people's blogs until they paid attention to me. And that's how I sort of got, the ability to sort of have an audience. And so it's like anything else. It's like, being good is important, but it's also neither necessary nor sufficient. I mean, it's very possible that if I had tried to start in 2011 rather than 2008, nobody would have ever heard of me, right? Because there's network effects, right? Like people, part of the reason people have signed up is because they've just heard my name for so long. That being said, it's like there's never been a harder time to just get paid and make a living being just a writer, but it's never been easier to make some money being a writer, right? Like I have to me, like the sort of classic Substack thing for me is not people like me. And for the record, I make like a quarter of what Matt Iglesias makes, right? So there's people who make a lot more than I do, or a third or something. But like to me, like the real Substack success story is not people like me who can just do this for our profession. The real Substack success story is a number of people who make $800, $1,500, $2,000 a month, and it is maybe not necessarily their profession, but it is an ability to monetize their writing in a way that they never had before. So yeah, it's a good service. I wouldn't say it's any better than rolling your own on WordPress or something else. I wouldn't say it's any better than Ghost, which is a competitor. But it is a very good CMS, and it really is painless to start getting paid. But it's like anything else in the industry right now. It is an extremely crowded field at the exact same time as a lot of the legacy publications that could pay you are dying. So,
and they are, and I think it's a little more cancel. Do we say cancel culture anymore? I think it can be more controversial and be less prone to the histrionic mobs that would come after people. You have a little better, you just got a better platform to get to the truth. I mean, that was the New York.
And I think what it's done, and I really appreciate, is it's bought independence. And that's what I see. I mean, I can't speak for Freddie. He has to make, he can make that call himself. But in the 2 years since he's been on before and now, I've seen this giving him the kind of the escape from academia and a level of independence that I find very exciting. I mean, I don't know you well enough to know what your future holds. I mean, you might become bought off in the future for all I know. I'm not predicting that, but where you are now, to me, is a very good place.
Right.
And very few people have that independence.
Yeah.
And I've got it because I'm old and I'm retired, and I give a shit what people think about what I say. And so there's no one's going to buy me off. But you're making a good living. I understand that you're making a good living, and I think that's going to buy you and has bought you the chance to become much more influential, but not just influential in terms of becoming a celebrity or a brand, but in saying interesting things. What Pat alluded to earlier about writing about a lot of different topics and writing well about them. That's so important.
Right.
So I'm excited. I hope others will follow your path.
Oh, yeah. I'll link to it for sure. It's an absolute must.
But you have to make a living. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, if I can continue to do this to pay the bills and then write books and keep writing books, which, is like a Hail Mary to sort of have some sort of permanence to sort of what I'm doing, something that will maybe last a little while, then that made me very happy. I will say, like, look, it's, I definitely value the level and kind of independence that I have, but it's like, I don't have a boss. I have 6,000 bosses, right? Like, like the people who pay to subscribe. In other words, like we all got to serve somebody, right? Like there's no such thing as total independence, but the kind of independence that I have is very valuable to me, and I'm very grateful for it.
Do you miss Brooklyn?
Yeah, I don't miss the living conditions that I lived in Brooklyn, right? Like, I definitely miss Brooklyn. I miss walkability. I miss so many different things to see, people to see, all the variety, the wonderful things. as someone who makes a lot of money compared to the median American, my quality of life was so absurdly low in Brooklyn because of the prices there that it's staggering that ordinary people live there. And so, I could not possibly be happier with the improvement to my daily quality of life. I do miss Brooklyn, but like everything is better for me here. So
Yeah, that's good. Well, that's good. Well,
What do you make of the election? What do you make of the politics of today, of the moment? You've
I
got
don't know. I keep
Kennedy
thinking,
Kennedy Jr. announced that he's going to be an independent. You've got Cornel West outside the Democratic Party. What do you make of all this?
yeah, I think RFK Jr. is a lunatic, but I also think that like he has a fair grievance, which is that the Democratic Party was not going to allow any debates, and we're clearly going to do everything possible to obstruct him in their primary. And I would have much rather have him be a participant in a real open primary where Biden could then beat him if he can beat him, and then we could say, okay, we've settled that. Let's move on to the general election. Now he's going to play spoiler, and you got to reap what you sow if you're the Democrats, right? If you constantly make your primary process into such a sort of closed, top-down autocratic model, people are going to go third party. As far as the election in general, I keep waiting for Biden's approval number and the polls against Trump to just sort of suddenly improve, because in many of the fundamentals, particularly the economy, which is doing pretty well, you'd think that he sort of would be in a position of strength, and he's just not. And in terms of the polling, and I just think I just don't know. He looks and sounds like an 80-year-old, and it is not what people are looking for in a president. And so I don't know. I have said the bar here is incredibly low, and it still doesn't make him good. But he's, at least in terms of domestic policy, he's probably the best president of my lifetime, right? Yeah. Which is like, it's like Mo was the smartest of the Three Stooges, right? It's not much of an award, but he's probably the best. But I don't know. I just think that like people don't want to vote for someone that they feel might die in office. And the really scary thing, if you're a Democrat, is if he is unable to be the candidate, which again, at his age and with his health, is a possibility. I think the Democrats understand that Kamala Harris is unelectable, but trying to push her aside in favor of Gavin Newsom or anyone else would spark a civil war that would destroy the party. If you try to move aside Kamala Harris, whose approval rating is even lower than Joe Biden's, who is one of the least naturally gifted politicians I've ever seen in my life. If you try to push her aside for somebody else, especially a white man like Gavin Newsom, it will start a civil war that will destroy the party. And that just seems like a very bleak potential outcome to me. But I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Our next podcast is with Teresa Amato, wrote a book, The Grand Illusion, The Myth of Voter Choice. She worked on Ralph Nader's campaign, and the gist of the book, even it's a couple of years older, is that we have one of the most dysfunctional electoral system where the two parties just can destroy any opposition, and we don't have a choice. I mean, Cornel West is just remarkable, and why can't I vote for him? Because I'm voting for Trump. Anyway, it's bad.
Yeah, agreed.
Keep writing. You've got a couple fans on the East Coast and West Coast, Freddie. So I wish you luck with this book and your future books, and just know that every time you publish your Substack, there's a couple of people that really enjoy reading it. So,
well, thanks so much for having me again, and I'd love to come back another time. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Freddie.